Welcome back to the Reliably Intermittent Podcast. Back at it again for full episode 8. Actual episode somewhere between 8 and 22. Again with me is Drew Esposito. Drew, how you doing?
I'm not doing bad, but I feel like everybody I know is getting pushed into some type of quarantine. So it has been a real cluster of shuffling schedules lately.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that circle, that 6 degrees of separation thing, it seems to be getting closer to like 1 and 2 degrees of separation at this point.
For sure.
As always, I'm Aaron Ware, back again, ready to ride. And today we're diving into, I think, a bit of a more meaty topic than some of the topics we've thrown out here. We're not just going to talk about man caves today or other goofy shenanigans that we can just point and laugh at people. So we thought, who better than to bring in for such a meaty topic than one of our big guns at Clemens Nelson, our Yoda, Pete Nevada. Pete, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, couldn't think of a better person today. You want to tell our listeners who maybe may not be so familiar with you a little bit about you?
Yeah, they call me Yoda because I'm old as dirt. I've had the dubious distinction of representing public sector entities for 45 years, beginning in 1975 with the Attorney General's office and spending quite a few semesters there before coming to Clemens Nelson 34 years ago. And throughout that period of time, I've seen just about every level of government involved in some type of litigation. I've participated actively in that, and I've been part of the company's team in putting together an effective response, and no less so under the COVID crisis, because all of the people that you see here collectively got together several months ago, in fact, going into February, March, and we tried to predict what the issues are going to be that we will be seeing on the employment front. And up to this point, we've been fairly accurate at predicting where the points of controversy were going to be. And I think this is a continuation of that process.
Sure. Just to be clear, Pete's nickname is Yoda. I think he gave it to himself. Clemens Nelson loves its employees that are over 40 years old. that is Pete, please, for the camera, say I waive all claims to age discrimination.
Understood.
Yeah. No, I know I can speak for Drew here. Pete's the guy that when we were, because Drew and I started with Clemens Nelson about the same time, and it was always, hey, if you got this complicated thing come in, here's Pete's number. So run that by him, see what he thinks. And he's going to kind of swashbuckle in and give you something that I think not too many people have thought about because he's run into it. So let's dive into what we're going to talk about today. It's obviously another one of the variations on the ongoing hashtag 2020, hashtag quarantine life, whatever you want to call it, in HR and the world writ large. It's another COVID-19 topic. This week, the CDC director said, among other things, that the next 3 months are going to be some of, if not the most difficult times in U.S. public health history. We're seeing cases skyrocket. We're seeing hospitalizations skyrocket. Unfortunately, we're seeing deaths skyrocket relative to what we've seen this year. And, after 9 months of this, I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call. I'm not the only one out there listening. I'm not the only one out there in the world that's just kind of struggling to deal with this in one way or another, right? We talked about the 6 degrees of separation tightening. I think, though, what we're going to broach today is, at least for some of us, kind of a light maybe there out towards the end that maybe shines a light that there is an end to this mess approaching that can get us through the next few months. And in that, I'm talking about the various vaccines that are out there. Now, as Drew and I have said many times, this is not a political podcast. We're not here to get into the politicking any more than obviously some things just are inextricably linked. That's not what our role is here. We're trying to help issue spot. We're trying to help be that light at the end of the tunnel for our HR clients, right? That are out there that call us to help. We're trying to help give you a guide here on from 1,000 feet, because it's the podcast format. We're not going to be able to answer every one of your questions, but what we'd like to do today is give you some things to look at, some things to consider, and give you an opportunity to be proactive on this issue, because it's coming and you're going to have to deal with it. right?
100%.
You
It's
know,
already
so
started.
yeah,
I
yeah. I
mean-
mean, I just saw doing a little prep work for this today. As soon as 2 weeks from now, it's possible that the vaccines could be out in the US. It's possible as soon as next week over in the UK. It's here. You can't ignore it.
Mm.
So I don't know why you'd want to, but again, I'm not going down that rabbit hole. So Pete, Drew, where do you think we should get started?
Well, let me
guess-
say this just at the outset. I think there are several levels of inquiry that we need to make, particularly in the public sector. And I think the first level of inquiry is one that's probably the most overlooked. And that is, do public sector entities have a contingency plan, a continuity of operations protocol? What do they do if all of their employees in a particular office happen to be ill or quarantined? I don't know that people have adequately addressed that. We can kick that around for a little bit, but there aren't that many options. I know you and I talked about a few this morning.
Well, and lest anybody thinks that that's hyperbole, right? I know we've had multiple conversations in this office about our clients that call us and said, "Hey, we just had 70% of our operation either test positive or now have to be quarantined because they were around people. You know, we have 25 people. Now we have 7. What do we do?" Right? So that's obviously something that's been an issue going on this whole year. But with the cases going the way they're going, I think that's going to be more likely to be a call that we field. And I think that's what Pete, I think having a plan in place. I couldn't be more a fan of proactivity than reactivity than you'll meet anywhere. Because ultimately, the worst decisions are usually made in reaction to a thing than sitting down to think about how you can handle it in advance.
Yeah, I think something if a client, and I think a lot of employers, public and private, they don't have any plan. Some though may have a succession plan, like for advancement within the agency, like ideas of who could be the possible next CEO, the next medical director, the next superintendent, whatever have you, whatever business you're in, that may be. And that's a logical starting point, I think, to at least have a flow of a chain of command when someone's out of touch and they can't be on site. I think that's a good starting place for kind of creating contingency plan. Is it should link in with obviously who you would see filling the footsteps of, if your chief goes out, who's going to be the next one up.
I think that really illustrates that there are really 2 dimensions to this. There is a succession plan, which is your chain of command for devolution of
Yep.
responsibility. But there is also something that a lot of business plans call a COOP, a continuity of operations protocol.
Mhm.
And I think that's the overlooked component,
Yep.
because in most organizations, they're making the assumption that that's going to be something insular, something for one department. But if we have an outbreak of this in a particular county and all of the people in the county administration building are afflicted, where do we reach to get people to keep offices open, assuming there's a desire to do so?
Sure.
How do we
Yeah.
go about doing that?
And
I
that's
think,
where you need the plan.
yeah, and I think we talked about a couple of options this morning. I mean, one of the options is, I suppose it's possible for people in a county to sit down collectively together and say, look, we are the office dwelling component of county government, the auditor, the treasurer, the clerk of courts. We're people who process paperwork. And a lot of our people have transferable job skills from one department to another. And could we have formally or informally a cooperative plan, an agreement that will lend employees, and perhaps employees who would require very little cross training, employees who are already familiar with financial software, for instance? That is one possibility. Another possibility is something that years ago some of the health departments had to do. And that was going back into an example from the 1950s. And again, this is not my first pandemic. I encountered a first pandemic in 1954 during the polio vaccine period. And during that time, my mother, who had formerly been a public health nurse during World War II, who was then not working so that she could raise my sister and myself, was called back by the health department, along with a cadre of other nurses who were no longer working but still credentialed, to give vaccinations to a mass group of people. And I think that in some organizations, calling back people, calling back the reserve, calling back people who have departed but still know the system may be an option. In a lot of these agencies, you may have retirees, you may have people who left under good circumstances, who might be willing to come back as an intermittent during a period of crisis.
I
And
think
particularly if
especially
they can
with
do something remotely.
well, especially with the tech side, Pete, like you've got this callback, and I can easily see retirees that would want to do it, but out of fear and concern for their own health, wouldn't. You may be able to kind of activate, like you said, the reserves from a much more remote standpoint with the tech in place, and you'd probably get a lot more people that say yes.
I think that's something to be explored.
Yeah.
Now, there's no one solution here, but these are some ideas that I think a lot of our clients need to be talking about or thinking about. And that's the threshold consideration.
Mhm.
Now, next, beyond that, let's talk about the prophylactic approach. What can we do with respect to demanding or ordering employees to be vaccinated?
Yeah. Can we do it? I guess that's the question.
Well, the interesting thing is that this issue has been around for a long time. And believe it or not, this issue has been to the US Supreme Court in a case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which is venerable, meaning very, very old. The Supreme Court upheld a Massachusetts law that gave health departments the power to mandate that everyone get a smallpox vaccination. And what the court articulated there was that there has to be a real and substantial relation to the protection of the public's health and safety. That's the buzzword. That is the test. So the question is going to be, can we order our employees to be vaccinated? The answer is going to be maybe, because it's not going to be across the board. Remember that what we have seen over the last several decades in the development of EEO laws and Title VII laws is that our requirements have to be job related and consistent with business necessity. And the question is going to be, how reasonable is it for me as an employer to order a particular employee to be vaccinated by giving them a direct order on pain of insubordination of what's going to happen if they don't? And so I think this takes us really to something that we have to look at very closely. And that is, we have to take a look at the job. We have to take a look at the risk of that job. And we can't do it in a global fashion. I don't think we could take a look at employees in a particular job classification and say, generically, they all need to be vaccinated. Because we all know that in every job classification, people have different types of internal responsibilities. If we're dealing with people who are involved in healthcare, direct care, law enforcement, I think those are the people who are probably going to be easy to determine. But in other organizations, let's pick on health departments. In many health departments, you have someone who is effectively an archivist. They are in charge of birth certificates and death certificates. They may be in an office with very little contact except at a window that is almost like that you would see from a bank teller. Someone comes in, requests a document, it's slipped underneath. If there's a cost, it's paid, and it goes away. I don't know that that's necessarily the same priority for vaccination that we would have with a corrections officer, a sanitarian, or a nurse. And the same is true, let's say, law enforcement. Police officers, corrections officers, certainly are going to be people with a lot of public contact. Those are people we could expect to need to effectively test and vaccinate. But in many organizations that I've seen over the years, they have within a police department someone who is the evidence room technician. And in some organizations, it's very formalized. They effectively are in a vault, again, with a bank teller window, and they sign things in and out, and maybe no contact with the public to speak of at all. So again, perhaps a different type of priority. And in some police departments, that becomes an assignment that's almost light duty for someone who is an injured or disabled law enforcement officer.
Mhm.
So I think we have to take a look at job analysis and job risk analysis. And so I think the starting point for vaccination is to analyze your workforce, make a list of every position, and next to it, why you think it needs to be vaccinated. Public contact with people who have medical conditions, because that is likely to be exhibit number one down the road if there's a challenge.
So we've got some good news out there because I know there's a couple clients that I've had a variation on this conversation this year, right? The FFCRA that we've talked about on this podcast that we've talked about with our clients ad nauseum this year. They had the healthcare provider and they had the emergency responder exclusions written into the law. And we had a lot of discussions. it's not to the depth here that we're talking about with vaccinations. It's not to the depth probably in terms of the job task analysis that it would be for the vaccination question, but I think it serves as kind of a good guide, a jumping off point. Maybe not a guide, maybe a good jumping off point, because I know all the clients that I talked to, we sat down and looked at, okay, let's look at your jobs. Let's look at who's working here to figure out whether or not this exclusion or that exclusion is going to apply. It's a similar, with a different bent, with a different focus, it's a similar kind of analysis though, to figure out, okay, here's the rubric, so to speak. Does this job fit into it? It's going to be a similar analysis, kind of similar type of analysis, and going through and saying, okay, this job fits here. It's just with a different focus, I think is what I was trying to say. Like Pete was saying, we're going to look at who you come into contact with. What's your job? The sheriff's office is a great example, because you've got jobs that are very obviously, very clearly that are going to fit within that rubric, but you've got your evidence tech, you've got your dispatchers, right? Is that a job that talks to the public every day? Absolutely. Is that a job that comes into contact with the public every day? Unlikely, absent some kind of, odd one-off here or there. So that's where I think what Pete's getting at here in terms of the practical side of it is, you're going to have to look at that specific thing, the real and substantial relation to the protection of public health and safety. We're going to say that like 6 times, just so people if they take nothing else, they take that away from this today.
Yeah. And I know everyone's going to be looking, at this thing, 7 different ways. I'm going to try to be figuring out every case where how we can read this broad, like, so real and substantial risk to the public safety. And I know, like, talking on a podcast makes it easy because you're not trying to tell anyone to take a risk. Like, this is just the three white guys talking. So, but like, I would say, hey, if I'm a dispatcher, right, I'm going to mandate all of you get it, because if one of you brings it in and it spreads like wildfire, my dispatch is gone. And that is a substantial risk to public safety, because if I don't have dispatchers, well, that's a problem. I mean,
how are the guys that are out there face to face with the public going to know where to go?
Yeah, exactly. And you got to train them up. And it's not like you got a bunch of just dispatcher 911 operators waiting in the in the weeds for these jobs. They're there's not a lot of trained people, especially recently in like the past few years with the tech change that has happened on the dispatch side. There's been massive tech changes. So there's a lot of training there. But one question I have for you guys, and I don't know if there's going to be an answer for this. Do you think employers in general are going to try to utilize the FFCRA exemptions, right? Like, so if you're determined to be essential or determined to be like a safety person, so you were exempt from FFCRA stuff, whether it's expanded sick leave, expanded FMLA, if those people are so essential to that, are they so essential that they need to be vaccinated? Because we have a lot of clients that said our whole agency is essential, right? That's why we're remaining open.
Well, I don't know that there's one slide rule definition, but I think that's certainly a strong indicia.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, what we're going to be doing is piling up reasons why someone should or should not be vaccinated.
Kind of building your case.
That would be at the top of the list.
Okay. Now,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I was just saying, because ultimately what you're going to run into, right, is it's like you guys were just saying, we're essentially building a case. Ideally, I don't think we want to predicate the decision on like one thing. That's why it's so important to go in and look at what everything does, because I think your kind of approach, Drew, that you just mentioned, it's not even thinking outside the box. It's thinking in a totality of what the job does. And that piggybacks right off of what Pete was saying. You really have to sit down and look at what the job does, what the role is, who they come into contact with. These are all different factors that go into that decision. But then, as always is the case, you're going to run into that one wily employee that has a reason, right? And we can go, I think it's probably prudent to issue spot some of the reasons not to be vaccinated that an individual is going to come in. Because we can talk all day about this job, that job, this job, that job. The point is, as an HR person, as an employer, as an appointing authority, you have to go through and look at the different jobs and what they do within that framework, that broad kind of framework, to see how this is going to fit, how we can defend it, because then John Q. Public, Jane Q. Public is going to, or employee is going to come in and say, hey, not me though, for this reason. So maybe we ought to dive into some of the reasons that we're likely to hear.
So I agree. One question that one of my clients just asked the other day while I was out, if we're going to mandate, let's say we do a job analysis or an agency analysis, we determine what departments are likely to be essential to be mandation, and then we look within that department to see what jobs meet the task analysis as well. I think you can kind of do twofold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, who pays for it, right? Who's going to pay for this mandatory vaccine that's being ordered? Is it employer paid because we're requiring it? Is there any guidance? What's out there?
Well, I've had some dialogue about that with a health commissioner just yesterday, and they're anticipating that this will be free. It's a government distribution because it's for the benefit of all of society. And remember what statistics we're looking at here. We know from listening to at least Dr. Fauci that until 70% of the US population has some degree of antibody, we haven't achieved herd immunity. And that 70% figure is going to be achieved either by people having been exposed to it and having recovered, or through vaccination. So the government's interest is to make this as broadly available as possible and not make it something that only the wealthy can afford. Mm-hmm. Now, there may be times when people who are outside of the priority groups may, if the vaccine is available, be able to go to a healthcare provider or something like that and request a vaccination. But even today, if you go into a Minute Clinic or a Kroger's for a flu shot, it's going to be free because most of your insurance picks it up because of the minimal cost. I mean, this is societal benefit. This is not something just for the individual. So the cost should not be an object. I think we get into structuring a policy. That's when we'll start to look at some of these issues. But you've all said, okay, what are some of the valid reasons that people might give for saying, I don't want to be vaccinated? And obviously at the top of that list is going to be a medical reason. We know that historically, when we were dealing with influenza vaccines that were incubated in egg white, that some people had allergies to eggs, and for that reason could not take some of the influenza vaccines. And over the years, they've eliminated that and made them much more friendly. But there may be people who, because of some medical condition, some ADA recognized condition, may have a valid reason for saying, I must respectfully decline this vaccination. And then that begs the question then of what we do. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in the policy side of that. Someone may have a religious objection. There may be some particular religious group, I can't think of any off the top of my head, who don't want something introduced into their body.
The only one I could think about when I was talking about this just earlier with a fire chief was I couldn't remember if Jehovah's Witnesses could potentially fall in that, because I know there's something with having their blood taken, but I didn't know if there's anything with inoculations.
I don't know, but that's certainly something to hold out there. And again, the whole question there is going to be one of balancing. You know, it's going to be the same thing that we've run into. And there may be people who claim a First Amendment privilege in the public sector that doesn't exist in the private sector. Mm. But again, we have to look for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And we have to look at that test that was articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And then we have to take a good hard look at how do we walk through that process. And I think what we're going to discover when we get into the policy side of this is we already have a template. That's under the ADA. If someone identifies that they have a disability, what's the employer's knee-jerk reaction? What do we say to the employee? How can I help you? Mm-hmm. And that then goes on to what they call the interactive dialogue. And a formal interactive dialogue is where the employer or someone in HR sits down with the worker and says, okay, this is your position description. Here's what you have to do. These are the essential functions. Here are the concerns that you have, or the disabilities or restrictions that you have. How do we make all this work together? And there may be job restructuring. There may be some things that can be done. But if at the end of the day, that leaves essential functions unfulfilled, then we go down the next hierarchy within the interactive dialogue. And that is there an opening where this person can be placed, where they don't have the types of concerns that are being articulated? Mm-hmm. And certainly if there is, that's where we put them. But if it goes down through that and there's still no way to accommodate, what is the accommodation? Well, an indefinite period of leave can be an accommodation. And fortunately, we have a vehicle for that in Ohio called involuntary disability separation, which basically puts someone's job in suspended animation for up to 2 years until they're cleared to return. And I think we have to view that as a level of reasonable accommodation for ADA purposes. And I think that's going to be part of the bag of tools that we carry in this interactive dialogue.
Well, and that highlights, again, I know we're stressing, we're harping on some of the same things, but that highlights why it is so important to know what the job does. To be able to say, okay, if you're telling me you can't be vaccinated for whatever, legitimate reason, but that
Trypanophobia, fear of needles.
sure, whatever the reason is, then it comes back to, okay, well, based off what you're telling me, you now can't do X, Y, and Z essential function of the job because we know the job requires it. And we've taken that proactive approach to identifying the job's functions, the essential functions, the duties, and more importantly, that we have to have them done in this context too, like we talked about, that task analysis, right? That is why the things we talked about up front are foundational. They're so important, is because once you get into the situation where, hey, not me comes up, you can identify how to react in the way that Pete just mentioned, right?
So what are some of the things that you think a policy should include?
Well, let's talk about that, because I think for the first question here, and we're going to be juggling a couple of concepts here. The idea behind having a policy is to have something that's defensible and workable. And based upon my experience in government over the years, the most defensible policy is going to be one that flows from a municipal ordinance. I would rather have this passed as an ordinance, as a regulation on employees, than be a unilateral policy imposed by the employer, for a number of reasons. And we can talk about those as well. But understand that if something is a legislative pronouncement, City Council, at least to the extent of the statute in Ohio, has legislative immunity from any liability flowing from that pronouncement. That's a good thing, because what it means is that the employer who implements that is not the policy maker. And it's the policy maker who sometimes gets sued in a 1983 action. So what this does is it gives us a way to implement what needs to be implemented without anyone having to stick their neck out. So that's the first stage. So let's say, whether we're talking about an ordinance or a policy, what are some of the things that we need to be looking at? Well, I can tell you that one of the things that we have to make sure that we're looking at are all of the variables that may come up as people try to work their way through the policy. I'll give you an example. When we talk about in the policy about the possibility of that interactive dialogue, invariably the employee is going to come in and say, I can be perfectly protected by personal protective equipment. I don't need that vaccine to do my job. And there may be times when that may be accurate. But let me give you an example of a time when it isn't. Let's say that we have someone who is a social service worker, whose job it is to check on neglected or abused children. And they say, as long as I wear my gloves, my mask, and an eye shield, I should be fine. And up to a point that may be accurate. But what happens when they walk out to the home of someone who is not necessarily receptive to what they're doing? And they say, I am here to check on your child, or take your child to a visitation. And the person says, let me see your ID. And the person pulls out their picture ID. Now that occupant of the house is going to say, I can't tell a thing looking at your face. Take off your mask, take off your shield. I need to see your features to make sure they match what's on the ID. What just happened? All the best plans sometimes go awry. So we have to build those contingencies in. Now, the policy itself, we've presaged this earlier today. Every policy that you're doing as a standalone policy generally needs a good, strong introduction, because you have to tell people as part of the educational process, why are we doing this policy and what is it about it that's important? And that's why I think that we have to do a policy that articulates some of the things that we're talking about here, that it is because there's a real and substantial relationship to the protection of the public's health and safety at play. And I think we use those buzzwords in the policy introduction so that later on, if there's a question, we can say, this is what we said. Oh, by the way, that mirrors exactly what the US Supreme Court said in Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Funny that we have a perfect precedent to support what we've done.
Yeah.
Reverse engineering is sometimes a good thing. So I think a good introduction. And I think the other thing that I would recommend is include in that policy, or as an appendix to it, that list of jobs that are going to be covered by the mandatory vaccination policy. And understand that we may not be reinventing the wheel here. In many organizations and many places, they have had mandatory vaccinations for decades. Look at all of the organizations that have to have hepatitis B vaccination.
Yeah.
So this is just one other type of vaccine. So it may be that there is not going to be this tsunami of opposition that we might anticipate. It might just be more so of the same. The other thing that I think we need to articulate is that this vaccination, if we're going to require it, certainly is going to be at no cost to the employee, and we're going to administer it on paid time. We're not going to beg the question of whether someone is entitled to half an hour of overtime by showing up at some mass inoculation clinic, because we'll just do it on site to the extent that that's possible. Or if we have to send people to a remote site for it, fine, they'll do it on the clock. Because I think that beats down one level of opposition. The other question is, looking at your organization, how many different types of vaccinations might you already require, and why not combine those in one policy? For instance, influenza, Tdap, either tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis B, and eventually COVID. I think we have to have if we're going to justify a vaccination for COVID, then we perhaps need also to take a look at the other things that may be as equally virulent. And so that's certainly a consideration in the policy. The other thing that I think, and I discussed this with the health commissioner yesterday, is they're going to be scheduling flights. What do I mean by that? That means that they're not going to take everyone in the workforce, round them all up, drop them off to be vaccinated, because they have to plan for the contingency that some people may have some type of a reaction. We know from the third phase trials that those reactions are minimal, but some people did feel a little out of sorts, achy or feverish for 24 hours. So we have to make sure that we don't inadvertently shut down the workforce by putting everyone into the vaccination pool at the same time. You may stagger that by several days, a week or 2 weeks, so that we have people there working, we have people who are not in the process of reacting. And so that's a scheduling issue. And even within some of these organizations, they may have their own internal priorities. It may be that someone who has minimal contact, but some contact, is not going to be in the first flight. But people who are home healthcare workers, police officers, certainly going to be in that first flight, sanitarians. Then I think the next question is going to be one of verification. How do we verify? What will we have to document this in the file? And I think that is yet to be told. We don't know what's going to be provided. It could be electronic. It could be a piece of paper like it was in 1954 when I got the Salk vaccine. At that point, they gave you a 5x7 card so that you could go back and get into school or go back to your job. Because back then you couldn't go to school without your vaccination. So you had to show that card to the teacher and they checked off the box. The next thing I would recommend that a good policy have is a protocol for seeking an exemption. And we can outline there that it should be in writing. It should articulate why without going into detail that would elevate that to the level of a medical record. We can reserve that information for the interactive dialogue. And certainly if the employee wants to bring in medical information, we have to make sure that we treat that appropriately, that it doesn't become part of a general personnel file, that we keep that separate from the things that can otherwise be a public record. But I think that procedure for seeking an accommodation should also walk through what the protocol is going to be as we inquire into the need for it or the integrity of it. And that's really a memorialization of the interactive dialogue that we've talked about under ADA and earlier today. And we've all walked through those before, and we try to keep them friendly and upbeat. They're not confrontational, because the bottom line is, the question is, what can we do to help you? How can we work through this together? How can we keep you in the job that you need to do, that we need you to do?
So
Yeah, I think people need to get comfortable too. I know they're not confrontational, but I think people need to get comfortable with the ADA aspect that when you're starting to inquire when they refuse and then they say it's because of some medical condition, right? That you have the right to know about the medical condition, right? That's part of the interactive dialogue. And when the employee goes, none of your business, you got to be comfortable with the fact that there's information they have to provide for you to evaluate what accommodation there is. I think that's going to be coming up because society right now is still so fractured, and we're getting this none of the business. Don't infringe on my information. I feel like providing the reason for your sick leave was always a big issue. So I think it's going to come in now more than ever. And HR professionals just have to be comfortable with, look, you got to give me the information I'm asking for so we can go through this accommodation discussion.
I think that's an important point. I think that's really ultimately the key to enforcement. Because I think ultimately in this policy, we have to write out the steps for what is the effect of non-compliance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we have a non-compliant employee who has a legitimate excuse, then we're going to be working with them to keep them in the organization, make sure that they have an alternative that is, there's something they're able to do. But if we have someone who is simply taking a hard stance, be it political, be it personal, whatever it is,
that's
I
the
think
one.
then we have to walk through the various elements that the Supreme Court has articulated for insubordination. And that is, we have to make sure that they're aware that we're giving them a direct order. We're not using weasel words like you ought to be vaccinated or you should be vaccinated. We have to make it imperative. You shall, you must.
Yeah.
And then we have to make sure that's communicated to employees and communicated again and again and again.
Yeah.
And then we have to make sure that if there's someone who's non-compliant, we explain to them we're going to have to regard them as non-compliant. That's going to be insubordination. There are disciplinary consequences to that. And those disciplinary consequences could include discipline up to termination. And we have to give them then a chance to walk it back and comply.
Mhm.
Well, see, that was going to be the next logical question to me, right? We're going through all these righteous reasons, all these things that righteously trigger that interactive dialogue process. But if we run into somebody who's not going to be compliant just because you can't make me, I mean, in a nutshell, right? What do? I think that triggers, though, a logical under that umbrella of non-compliance, right? I think you just articulated really well. What do we do with the non-compliant, non-righteously employee, non-righteously non-compliant? But for our clients, because we're going to encounter some that are going to go, well, why do I have to do this? What, like you're telling me, Aaron, Pete, Drew, you've gone through and elucidated all of the different reasons why the vaccine's a great thing. I don't know that I think so. I'm an elected official. What is it about this? I'm a policymaker. Like, what if I don't? What if I don't think we should be compliant because of whatever political reason or whatever reason? I said political. I promised up front I wasn't going to get into the P word. But why is it important for employers, policymakers, appointing authorities, elected officials, right? What's the risk to them?
Well, I'm seeing a briefing on this every day from one of the online services with whom we have a subscription. And COVID litigation is the next wave. And we're seeing it at different levels. We're seeing it by customers who are claiming that they were infected by going into a business, or they were infected by someone who came to their home for an installation or repair, and they want compensated for that. We're seeing it by employees who believe that they have been made ill by having to go out and have contact without adequate personal protective equipment. And we're seeing in the context of OSHA, believe it or not, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Now, the background there is OSHA at the federal level applies to private sector employers. It has what they call a general duty clause. A general duty clause requires that every employer provide a workplace free of hazards, or to the extent possible. Now, in the early 1990s, Ohio passed its own version of OSHA. It's 4167 of the revised code. It creates a committee. It puts a lot of the enforcement mechanism with BWC and the Industrial Commission. But the regulations that they promulgated back in the 90s adopt OSHA standards. So what is OSHA saying? OSHA is saying that right now, employers have a duty to be doing temperature checking. They have a duty to making sure that people who are exhibiting symptoms do not stay in the workplace. And they're also going to be saying that vaccination is an adjunct of that general duty clause.
Mhm.
Now, where does that come up for us? Well, a couple of different ways, aside from the fact that it's a general duty issue that may be enforceable administratively by a state agency. It's also something that has an ancillary analysis. In the public sector, our clients, be they city or county, have generalized immunity under 2744 of the revised code. And it's a complicated process. Most of the time, they have an immunity for anything that's a governmental function. And a governmental function is something that's imposed on them as a matter of law, like billing people for taxes or something like that, law enforcement. Proprietary functions are those things that we do that are allowed but not dictated, that a government gets into. And a lot of that is a lot of the services that are provided by cities and counties. And the question there becomes, is there immunity? Well, there is at the first tier. It's a three-tiered analysis.
Mhm.
They start with the presumption that there's going to be some immunity. And then you go to the second level, which looks at 5 different exceptions to immunity to see what's present. And there's an exception to an exception at the third
Yep.
level. But the analysis all comes back to this. You are immune if your conduct is mainly negligent. If, however, your conduct becomes something in bad faith, wanton, or reckless, then immunity can be lost. Now, what is reckless? Reckless has multiple definitions throughout case law. As a general proposition, it's where you perceive you know of a real risk and you proceed anyway, notwithstanding that knowledge. If we know that COVID is out there, it's a risk. And how many declarations of an emergency does it take to rise to that level? And we order employees who are not fully protected to go out and enter that risk pool. And we order people to go out and interact with customers. And those customers are then infected. We may not have that full liability that we would like. The concern that I think we have in all of this is that matters of immunity and the existence of recklessness are going to go to a jury.
Mhm.
There's no one size fits all way that we can look and say, this is the way it's going to come down. And so the concern over that liability is a real one. And in addition to that, I haven't really worked through the full scope of what we are looking at.
Well, and Pete, we talked a little bit about this 2 episodes ago, or just last episode. And it's not just Ohio. Like there's variations on these laws across the United States, but you're hit right on the nail for applying Ohio's law to kind of somewhere else. It was out in Iowa. There's a big company that's getting sued, and it's basically for fraud, misrepresentation, and they're trying to work around workers' comp because they're saying the employer knew that there was mass infections and they moved employees from one unit to another with all the knowledge, and it was beyond negligent. It was reckless. They didn't give enough PPE. They told people that they would test them, but they didn't. So they made all these assurances, and they're actually in the process of a lawsuit right now.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of all 3 of them. There was an element of bad faith. There was some wanton, just whatever. We just got to do this, what we're going to do. We don't really care what happens. And then there's, it was kind of all 3 of the things all wrapped up into one.
I mean, it's a perfect that you just mentioned it. And we just were talking about this case because the headline was employers like executives create like death pool. And they were basically like wagering how many people were going to get COVID within the agency.
Yeah,
that was the salacious fact, but the real meat of the lawsuit was fraud, bad faith, and things like that.
Yeah, that is reminiscent of the Ford Pinto fiasco from the 1970s with the exploding gas tanks. And also remember the same considerations that go into whether we have the reckless conduct, whether we proceed knowing that there's a risk, whether we proceed knowing that there's something we shouldn't be doing and we do it. Those are all variables that come into play in a 1983 action when you're claiming some type of qualified good faith immunity. Yeah. And again, those are all the things that we have to be cognizant of in putting together our policies. And again, when we put together these policies, one of the things I would certainly recommend is that we make sure that we have written into the policy that any information that comes into our possession of a medical nature is going to be maintained as confidential
Yeah.
medical information.
Absolutely.
It's not going to be part of someone's personnel file, and we give that assurance so that we can foreclose someone's objection on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of variables, and we can put this in a lot of different contexts. We've taken the large ones here up to this point,
Yeah.
because I think the logical starting point is our clients need to determine, do we need a contingency plan to stay in operation, that
Yes.
continuity of operations protocol? And if we are going to expect to stay in operation, are we going to take a look at our workforce and say, yes, we need to have X, Y, and Z number of employees vaccinated, and perhaps we have our own triage of hierarchy of needs. Which employees go first?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have flights? And then, of course, the written policy. And policies can be controversial at any of several levels. And that's why my recommendation is to run through an ordinance, because we have just seen within the last several days, the Supreme Court express kind of deference to an ordinance that affected manning for a city. And so that kind of gets the monkey off the back of city administration.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we have to bypass the ordinance and go into making policy, then we get into a lot of other issues. And whether we want to go into those today or not is another question.
No, I think ultimately, I think at this point, I think we've sufficiently highlighted some of the issue spotting, right? If the idea here is to generate in the minds of the folks that are listening, in the minds of the folks that are watching,
Yeah.
here's the things you need to be cognizant of, and you need to be acting on quick, fast, and in a hurry. I think that's going to set them up for success in the event that some of those things down the road come to fruition, right? I think ultimately the foundation needs to be set now before
think
the
it does.
vaccine becomes
Absolutely.
real.
And I think that, and without getting into other topics, like I say, use the buzzword language in your introduction. Talk about the emergencies that have created an exigent circumstance.
Mhm.
Talk about those things. Give us something to fall back on, to use
Mhm.
as ammunition should there be an issue down the road.
And I think this is, I almost could say this is like businesses that were applying for the PPP loan. Like, you need to have the policy in place now so that when your employees are eligible for the vaccine, whether they're tier 2, whether you're an agency that has some employees that are tier 1, like a private ambulance company or a fire, department that runs EMS, whether you're a private hospital, like, you don't want to be the tier 2 people that have a nice crack at it. Like engineers and those types of firms, paving roads, plowing stuff, they may not be technically tier 1. They'll probably get the second round. And if you don't have the policy in place that suggests they're going to mandate and you're trying to scrap it, those vaccines may be gone and moved on to the next tier 3. Like, so if you're going to decide to mandate or decide to go this route, you need the policy in place. It's like Aaron said, you don't want to be reactive, because they're only going to be 40 million doses, in December, hopefully, maybe another 40 or 50 in January, and so on and so forth. So you don't want to get stuck as a tier 2, tier 1 operation, and you're getting your doses in April and May with the rest of us schlubs. Like, you could be in full operation. So,
All
just a
right.
word of caution.
Well, Pete, thank you for coming in and joining us today and providing, I think, incredibly timely, incredibly useful content. Drew, as always.
Awesome.
It's been
Yeah,
real.
this is a good
Now,
one.
I think we've waited 8 episodes
I
to
think we're
really.
at 9.
Okay, whatever episode it is today, we've waited to really shill any of our services or products. We're just kind of throwing information out there, trying to get people to listen. What I'm going to vouch for us, because I'm partial, obviously. I would suggest you talk to the folks that you work with on this policy. Don't go into it half-cocked. Obviously, all of our clients, give us a holler. That's what we're here for. Let's talk through this. Let's work on
In that
this.
context, one final note.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to have to go the policy route as opposed to the ordinance route,
Good point.
there's something that they call diffusion of responsibility. And that is involve a number of people in the decision-making process. And I say that not to be facetious, but remember, you need people from the city administration, you need your risk manager, you need your statutory legal counsel, and you make sure that you're all singing from the same hymn book. That way, this isn't something that is the brainchild of one person. It's the collective genius of a group. If you can't get the legislative approach, take the next best thing.
100% agree. 100% agree. So I don't think there's anything better than that. That's a wonderful cherry on top of this Sunday today. So thank you guys. To the listeners out there, as always, like, subscribe, unsubscribe, resubscribe on the podcast feeds, and then unsubscribe, resubscribe again. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everybody. Join, just send this out on your LinkedIn's if you like us. You know, we've heard people, I've been out with clients now that are like, hey, I watched an episode. I can't stress enough. Tell somebody else. I'm super happy you're watching. Tell other people too. We want them to watch too. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts. Obviously, we've got the wonderful YouTube channel so you can see us in all our splendor. And until next time, thank you for joining us. And
stay safe, stay healthy.
Yep.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Over and out.
We want to thank you again for joining us on the Reliably Intermittent podcast. Now it's time for a bit of a disclaimer. This podcast and all others on this feed are for informational purposes only and not legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is formed by listening to this podcast or any others on the feed. Should you require or want legal advice, we encourage you to reach out to an attorney or statutory legal counsel, as the case may be. Thanks again for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.